The massive doors of Harmony Station slid open with a soft hiss, and Ambassador Lee Min-ho felt his heart skip a beat. He had prepared for this moment his entire career, but nothing could have readied him for the sight before him. The Velthani delegation stood waiting in the center of the gleaming conference hall, their crystalline bodies catching the artificial light and throwing rainbow patterns across the walls. They were beautiful and terrifying at the same time. Each alien stood nearly 8 feet tall, their bodies made of what looked like living crystal that shifted colors as they moved. Their faces were angular and sharp, with eyes that glowed like distant stars. When they spoke to each other, their voices created haunting melodies that seemed to echo from somewhere deep within their chest cavities. Lee Min-ho straightened his dark blue diplomatic uniform and walked forward, trying to project confidence. He didn't entirely feel. Behind him, Dr. Kim Jae-won adjusted his glasses nervously, while Colonel Park Seo-jun maintained his usual stone-faced expression. The 3 humans looked tiny compared to their alien hosts, but they had come here with a purpose that went far beyond what anyone could imagine. The lead Velthani, who had introduced himself earlier as Kethmar, turned toward the approaching humans. His crystalline features shifted through several colors as he observed them. To the human delegation, he appeared to be simply studying them with alien curiosity. But what the humans heard next would have shocked anyone else in the galaxy. "Look at these soft creatures," Kethmar sang in his native tongue to his companions, his voice creating beautiful harmonies that masked the cruelty of his words. "They waddle like infant grubs when they walk. How amusing that the galaxy considers them worthy of making contact with us." The other Velthani in the room began to create their version of laughter, a series of high-pitched crystal chimes that would have sounded lovely to anyone who didn't understand what they were actually saying. But Dr. Kim Jae-won understood every single word, every insult, every mocking tone. The tiny device implanted behind his ear was recording everything, storing each sound pattern and meaning for later analysis. For 23 years, Dr. Kim had dedicated his life to studying the Velthani language. Earth's intelligence services had been intercepting their communications since the first radio signals were detected coming from their home system. What had started as simple curiosity had turned into the most important linguistic project in human history. Now, as he stood in this room listening to beings who thought they were speaking in complete privacy, he realized just how valuable that work had been. Ambassador Lee Min-ho stepped forward and bowed deeply, a gesture of respect that had been practiced hundreds of times. "Welcome to our humble station," he said in carefully pronounced English, his voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment. "We are honored to meet with representatives of the great Velthani civilization." The sound that followed from the aliens was like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. But Dr. Kim knew it was the equivalent of humans bursting into laughter. Velith Kora, the female alien standing to Kethmar's right, created a particularly melodious sound as she spoke. "These mammals think ceremony matters," she sang mockingly to her companions, her crystalline body shifting to deeper blue tones. "How precious. Soon they'll understand their proper place as servants to superior beings." Colonel Park Seo-jun's military training kept his face completely blank, but inside he was fighting the urge to react. 3 decades of service had taught him to control his emotions, and that training was being tested like never before. The aliens saw his stillness as either fear or stupidity. They had no idea he was calculating distances, exit routes, and threat assessments while listening to every word they said about humanity's future enslavement. Dr. Kim caught Ambassador Lee's eye across the room and gave the smallest possible nod. It was a signal they had practiced, a simple gesture that meant everything was proceeding according to plan. The real negotiation was about to begin, but only the humans knew what was really happening. The Velthani continued their musical conversation, discussing the primitive nature of human technology and their plans for Earth's resources. They spoke of breeding programs and labor camps, of strip mining operations, and the complete subjugation of the human race. All of this was said in voices that sounded like the most beautiful choir, creating a disturbing contrast that made Dr. Kim's skin crawl. But humanity had learned patience along with the Velthani language. For over 2 decades, they had listened and learned, preparing for this exact moment. The aliens thought they were dealing with a primitive species that could barely understand basic concepts, let alone master a language as sophisticated as theirs. They were about to discover just how wrong they could be. The third day of negotiations began with what appeared to be progress, but Ambassador Lee Min-ho could feel the tension building in, his chest like a coiled spring. The Velthani had arrived that morning with what they called their final generous offer for humanity, a collection of documents that sparkled with their crystalline writing system. The conference room buzzed with the aliens' musical voices as they discussed the terms among themselves, completely unaware that every word was being understood and recorded. Kethmar stood at the head of the massive conference table, his crystalline body shifting through warm golden hues as he spoke to his aide in their native tongue. To any observer, it would have looked like a private conversation between colleagues discussing technical details. The reality was far more sinister. The third planet has excellent mineral deposits scattered across all 7 continents, Kethmar, harmonized in the beautiful, haunting tones that made his species' language sound like a symphony. Our geological surveys show particularly rich veins of rare earth metals in what they call Asia and South America. Once we establish our breeding facilities in the temperate zones, these humans will make adequate laborers for the extraction operations. Their small size and nimble fingers are perfectly suited for the tight spaces in mining shafts. His aide, a younger Velthani, whose crystalline body flickered between pale blue and silver, created agreeable harmonic responses. They discussed the logistics of human labor with the same casual tone that someone might use to talk about organizing farm equipment. The clinical detachment in their voices made Dr. Kim Jae-won's blood run cold as he listened through his neural implant. Colonel Park Seo-jun sat perfectly still across the table, his military bearing giving nothing away as he watched the aliens gesture toward holographic displays of Earth's continents. To the Velthani, his silence might have seemed like confusion or intimidation. They had no idea that behind his calm exterior, the colonel was memorizing every detail they revealed about their invasion plans, cataloging information that would later help Earth's defense forces prepare for what was coming. Ambassador Lee Min-ho lifted the crystalline datapad containing the proposed treaty, his hands steady despite the rage building inside him. The document was written in both English and Velthani script, but the English version had been deliberately simplified and altered. Key clauses that would essentially hand over Earth's sovereignty were buried in complex legal language that the aliens assumed humans wouldn't fully understand. They thought they were dealing with a primitive species that could be easily deceived by fancy words and official-looking documents. The treaty offered humanity access to basic galactic technologies and protection from hostile alien forces, in exchange for what was described as resource-sharing agreements and cultural exchange programs. But Dr. Kim Jae-won could see the real meaning behind every carefully chosen phrase. The resource-sharing meant strip mining Earth's entire surface. The cultural exchange meant the complete replacement of human society with Velthani control structures. Dr. Kim sat quietly in his chair near the wall, appearing to take notes on a simple tablet, while actually feeding real-time translations directly into Ambassador Lee's earpiece through a subdermal communicator no larger than a grain of rice. The technology was cutting-edge human engineering, completely undetectable by Velthani scanning equipment. Every insult, every plan, every casual discussion of humanity's future enslavement was being transmitted instantly to the man who would have to respond to their generous offer. The conversation took an even darker turn when Velith Kora joined the discussion. Her crystalline form had shifted to deep purple tones as she studied holographic images of human populations from around the world. The clinical way she analyzed different ethnic groups and age demographics made Dr. Kim feel sick to his stomach. "Their young show the most promise for our purposes," Velith Kora noted, her musical voice creating haunting harmonies as she spoke. "Children between the ages of 5 and 15 have malleable minds that respond well to indoctrination techniques. The breeding programs we established on Zerion Prime proved quite successful with similar mammalian species. We were able to increase productivity by 40%, within just 2 generations. She gestured to images of human children playing in schools and parks, discussing them like livestock being evaluated for purchase. The other Velthani in the room created agreeable harmonic responses, adding their own observations about human biology and psychology. They debated which populations would be best suited for different types of labor, which genetic traits should be encouraged or discouraged through selective breeding, and how long it would take to break human resistance to their new role as a servant species. Ambassador Lee's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, the only outward sign of the fury burning inside him as he listened to these creatures casually plan the destruction of human civilization. His diplomatic training had prepared him for difficult negotiations, but nothing could have readied him for this level of calculated cruelty disguised as business discussion. The aliens continued their musical conversation for another 20 minutes, covering everything from the construction of processing facilities to the timeline for implementing what they called population management protocols. They spoke of human beings like a resource to be harvested and managed, never once considering that the species they were discussing might have feelings, dreams, or the intelligence to understand what was being planned for them. Finally, Ambassador Lee set down the treaty document and looked directly at Kethmar. His voice remained perfectly diplomatic, giving no hint of the storm brewing inside him. "This is indeed a comprehensive proposal," he said carefully. "I believe my government will need time to fully consider all the implications of such a generous offer. Perhaps we could take a brief recess so that my team can discuss these terms in detail." The Velthani created their version of pleased laughter, believing that the humans were simply overwhelmed by the complexity of galactic politics. They had no idea that the recess would be used to plan their complete downfall. The 4th day of negotiations had started like all the others, with the Velthani speaking freely in their musical language while the humans sat quietly and listened. But something was different this time. The aliens had grown even more careless with their words, more brutal in their casual discussions of humanity's future. They spoke of Earth like it was already theirs, of humans like they were nothing more than animals to be managed and controlled. Dr. Kim Jae-won sat in his usual spot near the wall, his tablet in hand, listening to the most horrifying conversation. Yet, the Velthani were discussing what they called cognitive enhancement research, with the same tone someone might use to talk about the weather. But what they were actually describing was something far more sinister. Kethmar gestured toward a holographic display showing human brain scans as he spoke to his colleagues. "The neural tissue of their offspring shows remarkable plasticity," he harmonized in his beautiful, terrible voice. "Our scientists on Zerion Prime have developed excellent techniques for harvesting active neural pathways from subjects between the ages of 3 and 12. The younger specimens provide the most useful data for our cognitive enhancement programs." The other Velthani created agreeable musical responses, discussing the logistics of what they were planning as if they were talking about mining operations or agricultural projects. They debated the best methods for specimen collection, the most efficient processing techniques, and how many human children would be needed to supply their research facilities across the galaxy. Dr. Kim's hands began to shake as he listened. 23 years of studying the Velthani language had prepared him for many things, but not for this. These creatures weren't just planning to enslave humanity. They were planning to use human children as test subjects in experiments that would destroy their minds and bodies. The clinical way they discussed it, the casual tone they used when talking about harvesting neural tissue from living children, was more than he could bear. The preliminary studies suggest we could process approximately 2,000 specimens per facility per year, Velith Cora added, her crystalline body shifting to bright orange tones as she referenced data from previous operations. "If we establish processing centers on each continent, we should be able to meet the research demands of all 17 member worlds within the first decade of occupation." That was the moment Dr. Kim Jae-won snapped. He stood up from his chair, his tablet clattering to the floor as he faced the Velthani delegation. When he spoke, his voice carried the perfect intonation and harmonic complexity of a native Velthani speaker, creating crystal-clear tones that filled the conference room. "Velthes corum nai." Sethan mor Keelith Vessen. The effect was immediate and devastating. Every Velthani in the room stopped speaking at once, their musical conversations cutting off mid-sentence as if someone had unplugged a sound system. The silence that followed was so complete that Dr. Kim could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. The translation of his words hung in the air like a death sentence. Your words are heard. Your crimes are recorded. Kethmar's crystalline face began shifting through colors rapidly, deep blue, then purple, then a sickly yellow-green that Dr. Kim recognized as the Velthani equivalent of shock and fear. The alien's voice, when he finally managed to speak, had lost all of its earlier confidence and arrogance. Impossible, Kethmar stammered, his harmonics discordant and broken. Your species lacks the neural complexity for true Velthani speech. Our linguists confirmed that human vocal cords cannot produce the necessary harmonic frequencies. Ambassador Lee Minho rose from his seat with the fluid grace of a predator that had been hiding in plain sight for far too long. When he spoke, his Velthani was not just fluent, it was perfect, carrying the subtle accent and formal grammatical structures that indicated he understood not just the language, but the deeper cultural meanings behind every word. We understand more than you realize, Kethmar of the Third Resonance, Lee said, using the alien's full formal title with deliberate precision. We know of Zerion Prime, the 17 enslaved worlds, and your plans for Earth. We know about the breeding facilities, the processing centers, and the neural harvesting programs. We know everything. The color drained from Kethmar's crystalline features as he processed what he was hearing. A human was not just speaking his language. This primitive mammal was using formal diplomatic protocols that even some Velthani struggled with. The implications were staggering. Dr. Kim activated his tablet, and suddenly the air above the conference table filled with holographic displays showing decades of intercepted Velthani communications. Battle plans for the conquest of primitive worlds, slave quotas for different species, detailed orders for genocide operations that had wiped out entire civilizations. All of it was displayed in the original Velthani script, proving that humanity had been listening and learning for far longer than anyone had imagined. Document after document scrolled through the air, each one more damning than the last. Communications between Velthani military commanders discussing the most efficient ways to break the spirit of conquered populations. Scientific reports detailing the results of horrific experiments on captured aliens. Budget allocations for the construction of processing facilities designed to handle millions of slaves. How? Velith Kora managed to harmonize, her voice barely above a whisper. How could you possibly have intercepted our quantum-encrypted communications? Colonel Park Seojan stood up slowly, his military bearing now transformed from quiet observation to obvious threat. When he spoke in perfect Velthani, his voice carried the hard edge of a soldier who had seen too much and was ready for war. Because, he said, each word precisely enunciated in the alien's own language, humans excel at one thing above all others: learning. While you were planning our destruction, we were studying everything about you. Your language, your technology, your tactics, your weaknesses. We've been preparing for this moment for over 20 years. The Velthani delegation sat in stunned silence as the full scope of their miscalculation became clear. They had come to negotiate with what they believed was a primitive species, only to discover that their supposedly inferior opponents had been 3 steps ahead of them the entire time. The hunters had become the hunted, and they were just beginning to understand how completely they had been outmaneuvered. The shock of discovery lasted only a few moments before Kethmar's crystalline features hardened into angry red tones. The Velthani leader straightened to his full 8-foot height, his voice taking on the commanding harmonics that had intimidated countless species across the galaxy. You think your primitive understanding changes anything? He sang threateningly, his crystal body now pulsing with deep crimson light. We have conquered 17 worlds with technology your species cannot even comprehend. You may have learned our language, but you are still nothing more than soft-bodied mammals playing with forces beyond your understanding. Velith Kora joined her leader, her own crystalline form shifting to aggressive orange hues as she created, threatening harmonic overtones. Our battle fleets control this entire sector of space. Even now, Velthani warships are positioned at the edge of your solar system, ready to reduce your pathetic planet to molten rock if we give the command. The other Velthani in the delegation began creating a chorus of menacing sounds, their combined voices filling the conference room with what sounded like the approach of a deadly storm. They had been caught off guard by humanity's linguistic abilities, but they still believed their technological superiority gave them the ultimate advantage. Colonel Park Seojeon listened to their threats with the same calm expression he had maintained throughout the entire negotiation. Then, without saying a word, he reached across the conference table and pressed a single button on the control panel embedded in its surface. The room's massive wall screens flickered to life, showing the external view from Harmony Station's sensor arrays. At first, there appeared to be nothing but empty space dotted with distant stars, but then, like ghosts materializing from the void, sleek shapes began to appear around the station. The ships that decloaked were unlike anything the Velthani had ever seen. They were clearly based on familiar design principles, but refined and improved in ways that should have been impossible. The hull plating was smoother, the energy signatures more efficient, and the weapons arrays more sophisticated than anything in the Velthani fleet. Kethmar's voice cracked as he tried to maintain his threatening tone. "Your stealth technology, where did you—" "Improved," Dr. Kim Jae-won finished calmly, his own voice now carrying the confidence of someone who had been holding back the truth for far too long. "We didn't just learn your language, Kethmar. We mastered your science. Those ships out there use refined versions of your own designs, built with materials and techniques your engineers haven't even dreamed of yet." The Velthani delegation stared at the screens in growing horror as more and more human vessels revealed themselves. Dozens of ships, then hundreds, all equipped with technology that surpassed their own military capabilities. The fleet that surrounded Harmony Station wasn't just impressive. It was impossible according to everything they knew about human technological development. Ambassador Lee Min-ho activated another display, this one showing detailed star charts of the Velthani Empire. Red markers appeared on 17 different worlds, each one pulsing with activity indicators that made the aliens' crystalline bodies shift to pale, frightened colors. "While you were planning our enslavement," Lee said in perfect Velthani, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty, "we were freeing your other victims. Human fleets are already en route to the 17 worlds you've conquered, carrying proof of your crimes translated into each species' native tongue." The implications hit the Velthani like a physical blow. Humanity hadn't just learned their language. They had decoded every communication in the entire empire. Every secret transmission, every classified military order, every private conversation between Velthani officials had been intercepted, translated, and recorded. Dr. Kim activated his tablet again, and new holographic displays filled the air above the conference table. This time, the documents weren't just Velthani communications. They were intercepted messages in dozens of different alien languages. Communications from the species that the Velthani had conquered and enslaved, proof that humanity had been in contact with resistance movements across the galaxy. "The Zephyrians on Kepler 442b received our transmission 3 days ago," Dr. Kim explained, his voice steady as he revealed the scope of humanity's operation. "So did the Aquarians of Proxima Centauri, the crystalline hives of Wolf 359, and the botanical collectives of Tau Ceti. They now know exactly what you've been saying about them in your private communications." Velith Kora's voice became a desperate whisper as she tried to salvage the situation. "The Galactic Confederation will never believe the word of primitive mammals over established member species. Our alliance has stood for over 1,000 years." Colonel Park Seojeon stepped forward, his military bearing now openly threatening as he spoke in flawless Velthani. "We'll dissolve," he interrupted, "when every member species learns what you really think of them. We've been listening, Velith Kora. We know exactly what you call your allies when you think no one else can understand." New holographic displays appeared, showing intercepted Velthani communications discussing their supposedly equal partners in the Galactic Confederation. The documents revealed centuries of manipulation, exploitation, and outright contempt for the other species they claimed to work with as equals. The mantid collective that you call useful insects in your private messages, Ambassador Lee continued, his voice carrying the weight of absolute knowledge. The gaseous entities that you refer to as convenient energy sources to be harvested when needed. The silicon-based life forms that you've been slowly poisoning with atmospheric modifications, designed to make them more compliant. Each revelation was more damaging than the last. The Velthani had built their empire on lies, manipulation, and the assumption that they were the only truly intelligent species in the galaxy. Now all of their victims were learning the truth at the same time, in their own languages, with undeniable proof of every crime and every betrayal. Kethmar's crystalline body had shifted to a sickly grey color, the Velthani equivalent of complete defeat. "How many species have you contacted?" he asked weakly. "All of them," Colonel Park replied simply. "Every enslaved world, every exploited ally, every species you've ever wronged. They're all receiving the same package right now, complete translations of your communications, proof of your crimes, and an invitation to join the real Galactic Confederation. One based on actual equality and mutual respect." The room fell silent as the full scope of humanity's counter-operation became clear. While the Velthani had been planning the conquest of one small planet, the humans had been orchestrating the liberation of an entire galaxy. The primitive species that couldn't even understand basic technology had just dismantled a 1,000-year-old empire without firing a single shot. The hunters had become the hunted, and the game was already over. The Great Assembly Hall on Earth had never seen anything like it. Representatives from 19 different worlds filled the vast space, their forms as diverse as the stars themselves. Some walked on multiple legs, others floated in specially designed atmospheric bubbles, and a few existed as pure energy contained within crystalline vessels. What they all shared was freedom, freedom that had seemed impossible just 6 months earlier. Dr. Kim Jae-won stood at the center podium, looking out at the most remarkable audience in galactic history. The translation devices built into every seat hummed quietly as they converted his words into dozens of different languages simultaneously. Behind him, massive screens displayed the proceedings in visual formats for species that communicated through color patterns, light frequencies, and even controlled electromagnetic pulses. The journey to this moment had been swift but tumultuous. Within days of the confrontation at Harmony Station, the evidence packages had reached every enslaved world in the former Velthani Empire. The reaction had been immediate and devastating for the crystalline overlords. Species that had been oppressed for centuries suddenly learned that their suffering had been deliberate, calculated, and discussed with casual cruelty in private Velthani communications. The Zephyrians of Kepler 442b had been the first to rise. Their gaseous forms had swept through Velthani administrative centers like hurricanes, overwhelming the crystalline beings who had never expected coordinated resistance. The Aquarians followed within hours, using their control over water to flood Velthani facilities on their ocean world. One by one, across 17 different star systems, enslaved species turned on their masters with the fury of the long-oppressed, finally given hope. But it wasn't just rage that fueled the rebellion. It was knowledge. Along with the evidence of Velthani crimes, Earth had also transmitted detailed technical specifications for advanced technologies, weapons designs, communication systems, faster-than-light travel methods, all the innovations that the Velthani had kept from their subjects to maintain control. Suddenly, species that had been forced to use primitive tools were building their own fleets and defense systems. The Velthani Empire, built on technological superiority and the assumption that other species were too primitive to understand advanced concepts, collapsed like a house of cards in a windstorm. Their scattered military forces, facing coordinated resistance from multiple species armed with their own technology, surrendered within weeks rather than face complete annihilation. Ambassador Lee Minho had accepted the position of Director General of the newly formed Galactic Liberation Alliance with the same quiet dignity he had shown throughout the negotiations. From his office in what had once been the United Nations building, He now coordinated diplomatic relations with dozens of species, many of whom were still discovering what freedom actually meant after centuries of oppression. The transformation hadn't been without challenges. Colonel Park Seojun had established training centers on 12 different worlds, teaching Earth's rapid learning techniques to species who had been deliberately kept ignorant of their own potential. Some races had to relearn technologies their ancestors had possessed before the Velthani conquest. Others were exploring scientific concepts for the first time in generations. The silicon-based life forms of Vega Prime had proven particularly eager students. Their crystalline structure, ironically similar to their former Velthani oppressors, allowed them to interface directly with technological systems in ways that organic species could only dream of. Within 3 months, they had not only mastered the technology they'd been denied, but had begun improving upon it with innovations that astounded even human scientists. Dr. Kim cleared his throat, bringing the assembly's attention back to his speech. The translation devices adapted to carry not just his words, but the emotional undertones that made communication truly meaningful across species barriers. Language, he began, his voice carrying across the vast hall, is not just communication, it's understanding. And understanding is the foundation of freedom. The response from the audience was immediate and powerful. The Mantid collective created harmonious clicking sounds that their translators rendered as enthusiastic agreement. The botanical collectives released pheromone clouds that shifted colors to express gratitude and joy. The gaseous entities pulsed, with gentle light patterns that spoke of hope for the future. Dr. Kim continued, his words carrying the weight of the journey that had brought them all to this moment. For too long, the galaxy was divided by the assumption that different species could never truly understand each other. The Velthani used this assumption to build their empire, convincing their subjects that complex ideas were beyond their comprehension, that advanced technology was too dangerous for primitive minds. He gestured to the diverse audience before him, representatives of civilizations that spanned the galaxy. But understanding isn't about the shape of your body or the way your mind processes information. It's about the willingness to listen, to learn, and to see the universe through another being's perspective. When we truly listen to each other, we discover that intelligence and wisdom take many forms. High above Earth, in the prisoner transport, a vessel that orbited like a small moon, Kethmar pressed his crystalline face against the viewport. His once proud form had dulled to a lifeless grey, the color of defeat and regret. Through the communication system in his cell, he could hear every word of Dr. Kim's speech, translated into perfect Velthani by the same humans his species had, dismissed as primitive mammals. The irony was almost too bitter to bear. His entire civilization had been built on the belief that they were the most advanced species in the galaxy, that their crystalline structure and harmonic language made them superior to all other forms of life. They had conquered worlds and enslaved species because they genuinely believed that other beings were too simple to understand complex concepts or govern themselves effectively. But it had all been a lie they told themselves to justify their cruelty. The humans had proven that any species could master any concept if given the opportunity and the respect to try. They had learned Velthani language better than many native speakers, had improved upon Velthani technology, and had accomplished what the Velthani had always claimed was impossible. They had united dozens of different species in true cooperation and mutual understanding. Kethmar closed his eyes as Dr. Kim's speech continued, each word a reminder of how completely his people had misunderstood the nature of intelligence and civilization. The soft creatures that his species had mocked and dismissed had indeed found their place in the galaxy. They had found their place at its head, not through conquest and oppression, but through the simple revolutionary act of treating other beings as equals worthy of respect and understanding. The age of the Velthani Empire was over. The age of true galactic civilization had just begun.